Hi, Nate.
Hey, Tom.
I have a proposal for you.
That's good.
I think that we should call people who are still trying to get into Bitcoin at this point, after all the peaks and troughs that there have been, cryptozoologists.
Why is that?
Because I think that word should have larger purchase than what it has. So, a cryptozoologist is somebody who studies like the Loch Ness monster and stuff like that, like creatures that you've heard about. But they're literally
Is that a real term?
Yeah, it's a real term.
Oh,
People who
that's fun.
it's an official. I hesitate to call it a field, but yeah, people professionally, for lack of a better word, yeah, they call themselves cryptids, or like creatures that, like Paul Bunyan's ox, maybe would count. Big Blue or Baby Blue, I forget the name of it. And then the Loch Ness monster, Bigfoot, and Chupacabra, I guess, would probably count for this. The Jersey Devil would count for this. Anyway, I'm trying to
Wow,
expand
you
it.
know a lot of mystical creatures.
There's hundreds of them. Literally, this is great hits. But yeah, anyway, cryptozoology, I think should also...
Cryptozoologists.
Yeah, that's a real term. That wasn't
In
the reason.
5 years, the
Yeah.
new AI people will also be cryptozoologists. Welcome to this episode. We're recording off schedule, so we'll bring a special energy. We're going to start with traveling to DC. One of us moved there permanently, but it's kind of a good time. So we'll be in the same place, at least briefly. And DC is an interesting spot of AI right now. And then a kind of grab bag of what is real and what is not in the world versus the world of AI, and how that kind of shows where things are going. So I'm going to DC for the first time for something for AI. I've definitely been to DC, starting back with the normal. Up in the US, you go somewhere in your grade school days, you go to DC if you live on the East Coast, and you look at all the cool monuments, and a few trips since then. But I'm going to, as a representative of the Allen Institute, for some panel on NAIR. It's open to the public. I think this makes sense that there's a lot of AI interest these days in the Capitol. NAIR is the National AI Research Resource. Wow, I finally actually know what it is. It's currently in a pilot program, which really is just encouraging I think mostly federal context of the government and government resources to be available to the public sector to do research on AI. Anything from supercomputers to like NASA has satellites collecting data. It's trying to mobilize agencies to make it so AI is more studied in the public sector, both on like just raising money so that people buy or like have access to compute. There's a lot of weird things like Google and like Google or whatever donating a whole bunch of GPUs. I don't think anyone knows exactly what NAIR is going to be, which makes a lot of the politics around AI confusing, because it's some bucket of billions of dollars of resources that is everything from satellite imagery to cloud GPUs. And it's really easy to see as a researcher how cloud GPUs help you, but maybe in some ways that's like why NAIR might be slightly forward-looking, is that it gives a really broad lens of being included in AI research rather than just having like the requisite GPU count to actually train a large model, which I think both of us are like not that interested in that conversation every time. So I've been learning about this NAIR pilot thing, and I will surely have more thoughts after being on the ground and talking to people. There's a lot of policy. This is like the AI Expo on national competitiveness. I think that the wording is weird, but it's mostly about how does the government make it the United States the place where AI is developed in like a multinational way, and that it is relevant. I think we've seen a lot of conversations from the UK in this. It's like primarily in the UK AI Safety Institute, which is kind of unfolding, and now the US Safety Institute is coming up. And in 2025, a lot of this will actually come into part. So NAIR's in a pilot phase where the formal funding would need to start in 2025. And I think that's about when the safety institutes also want to get going. I think NIST has a new director, which is interesting. I mean, Paul Cristiano, I don't know if you have any encounters in coffee shops with Paul. I mean, you have Sam Altman stories. I think there's just a lot of processes underway. It's like, and that is, I think the scope of NAIR is the most confusing thing to me, where I'm getting introduced to it, and it's like this thing that so many companies are putting their hopes in. It's like good to be involved with it because it'll have a lot of momentum and a lot of money behind it. I think AI2's open models are commented in as part of this national AI research resource. And that's something that a lot of places take pride in. There's a long list of public and private organizations contributing, but we just don't know what it means. And just what does it mean that this big resource is crawling forwards? And maybe DC will have a role to play, which I think is interesting. And then we could see if you've plugged into any of that at all yet.
For me, yeah, I mean, government is process, I guess, for better and for worse. And AI is, at least it thinks of itself as being about results, for better and for worse, right? Benchmarks,
Yeah.
who beat them.
Gosh, you're going to nerd snipe me with the valuation, but we'll come back to that.
I mean, yeah, it's a different world. It moves at a different pace. It's got a different kind of capital that defines it, right? Political capital. It's just not the same kind of force as either money or hype or compute or whatever other metrics are really kind of at stake for social prominence and authority in the AI conversation now. Followers, I guess. That's another way to measure it. Yeah, it feels different when you're here. I moved here maybe 5 weeks ago now, something like that. And on a personal level, so I was in New York before this. I was living in New York for 2.5 years or so after finishing my PhD work on the West Coast. So yeah, I've been kind of thinking of this. There's kind of in America anyway, AI world is, you can kind of think of it kind of like a tripod, at least in terms of like, where are the kind of hotspots in one sense or another geographically.
I feel like there's so many tripod analogies that could be made, to be honest.
I was just going to make a very basic one between, Silicon Valley, Bay Area as like one leg. New York is a distinct leg. And then DC would be the third leg. And each of those legs feels different and they bring something very different to the table. And, one reason I moved to DC was it was, like Nate said, I went here as a kid. So it's not like it's the first time I ever visited the Capitol. But it's a world whose rhythms and personalities and flow and dynamics I wanted to understand and be a part of, because it reflects not just something I'd like to learn the skills of to master, but I guess on a personal values-driven level, I think it's a world that should matter and should be a part of what is going on in AI more than it has been. And I think many people now feel that way. I mean, we've been discussing this also, in the context of my work, especially at Berkeley. I was very embroiled in these debates that turned into controversies, that turned into spitting matches between, AI ethicists and AI safety people on the other hand. And we're still seeing it, but I think over the last year or so, or almost a year, a lot of those tensions have kind of been refracted into policy debates, right? Which kind of makes sense.
I like to run the counterfactual of if ChatGPT was delayed a few years and we were still in the post-stable diffusion moment. I actually think the safety versus ethics debate lands a lot more naturally in images, because there are these image models have such clear issues around non-consensual pornography and things. So it's the lenses that they had do actually make a lot of sense. Where it's almost with language models, you just had different axes.
So there's different aspects there, right? There's, of course, the risk itself, which is what you're pointing to, and the fact that images versus text, or just different modalities, right? They present different risks, and that's important. The other side of it, if we're running that counterfactual, is, and I think this hasn't been talked about enough, or I haven't seen others really pinpoint this, is that ChatGPT also mattered because its appearance, and then over the next several months, just the heatedness of the debates around what it meant. in many ways, we're kind of about who has the right to speak with authority about what's going on right now, right? And there was a strong, I mean, this was back when I used to be like on Twitter more regularly than I am now. There were strong fissures. I'm thinking of one. I think it's okay if this was sensitive last summer, but I'm just going to say it now because it's common knowledge. I think that there was a tweet from Christiane Lum, who has been more prominent on like the fact sort of ethics side of these conversations, where she made a tweet where she said something, and I guess I shouldn't misquote her, but you can look it up. It's words to the effect of, the only existential risk that we really should be worried about is the fact that people on the fact side of the aisle can't admit like highly capable systems when they see them. Like they're kind of not.
I've met Christian. Yeah. I met Christian at one of these like socio-technical AI safety workshops. So this like checks out so much because I didn't know the tweet at the time, but having talked with her, it's like, this is so reasonable.
So my recollection, and I believe this was it was almost exactly a year ago now. It might have been June of 23 now, but this was still like that. I guess I'm trying to articulate something specific that I think matters here, which is the debate that ended up happening. And that got very, like, there was a lot of heated exchanges that happened after she tweeted that. And you can go to the thread and you can see who wrote what in what order. And it was kind of an emperor's new clothes moment for, several of these conversations. But I think what was really going on there was that the question was not sort of whether you think ChatGPT is dangerous because it's racist versus because it could cause some kind of more AI safety specific type of harm at scale. The debate was more like, what is this? Like, is this even anything? And so at the time, the memes that were fighting were, this is the harbinger of something truly outstandingly takeoff laden versus this is a stochastic parrot. And that was just sort of the flavor of like, nobody, it was either you're on one side or the other. And there was sort of nowhere else to take it. And so I think that tweet stood out because she was kind of pulling the rug out from a certain kind of claim of like, we're acting like there's nothing here. But if a lot of people across the world are just deciding to regularly use this tool to save hours of work time to generate things, clearly it's something, and it's not just spitting out what somebody else already put into it. That seems to not be rich enough to describe it. So I guess
I think I found the tweet in the background too.
Okay.
On May 3rd of last year, where it's like almost exactly a year later.
Oh, that's funny.
From that, there's one existential risk I'm certain LLMs pose, and that's to the credibility of the field of fact/ethical AI if we keep pushing the snake oil narrative about them.
Yeah.
That is like a very rich statement. I almost like can barely follow it because there's like multiple lines of causality about like who is pushing the narratives of snake oil. So is it like, I think it's mostly that it's saying that like if the fact community keeps saying that language models are just nothing, they will be left behind. And that is honestly, a year on, feels kind of like what has happened. I think there are people from that community who have carved their own voice, or like people who are sympathetic to that community who have carved their own voice and are doing really well. I think this is funnily enough, but like there's the Substack like AI Snake Oil, which is like Sayesh Kapoor and his advisor Arvind at Princeton, like Melanie Mitchell at the Santa Fe Institute.
I know
she
Melanie,
has like AI for thinking humans. Like these people have kind of filled the gap that they have left, and I think they're doing a good job. But that's a year on, and it seems pretty on track.
Well, it's been interesting to see. So running back the clock, because I was a part of the kind of Gestalt conflict that happened across these lines, and I think in retrospect reached a fever pitch last summer, where I was in a lot of these rooms between people on one side or the other over the course of that summer, whether it was FACT or one of these AI safety convenings or whatever, where there were like attempts to reach across the aisle, so to speak, and come up with
I went to like 2 or 3 workshops in person to do this. So it's now a backroom. It's a backroom field. It can't be in the, it like doesn't work on Twitter.
No, it doesn't. And
I mean, I got invited to another similar one of these things in June, but it's like after I leave the Bay Area, so I'm like, oh, I'm not coming back for it.
I think what was interesting being in some of those rooms, and all without naming names, of course, my experience of it was that when you take people offline and you put them in a room together and they face each other as they say what they have to say, you have this experience of, as you're speaking, seeing the other person process what you were saying in a way that impacts the way in which you subsequently speak. And that's a very different kind of feedback loop than you see on social media, where it has this natural tendency to de-escalate, right? Because you're making eye contact with somebody who's at least processing what you're saying on their terms. And then people are just naturally motivated to, if you're already speaking, to try to speak in a way that the other person can follow, even if you disagree. And what was remarkable to me was this happened more than once, where there was a lot of unexpected empathy that emerged out of those rooms, because I think many people were expecting to fight. And actually what was most actually distressing to them was how emotionally and culturally commensurate they were with the other people across the other side of the aisle, at the same time that the words that were being used and the way they were using certain kinds of language, especially to refer to what was being built, were just different from each other. And in ways that were not fully intelligible. And so what became clear was, we're just not speaking the same language here. It's not so much that you even value fundamentally different things than me. Deep down, we actually seem to value lots of the same types of things, but we have fundamentally different languages with which to refer to those things and organize our thinking about those things, such that we end up telling radically different stories about what's going on. And I think in a way that was very healthy, but in another sense made people realize we're not yet in a position to resolve this in a substantive way. And so to tie that off, it's not surprising to me that what we've subsequently seen since many of those meetings transpired is, first of all, as Nate mentioned, some of them have been moved into more kind of backstage facing orientation, which, to be honest, kind of troubles me at the same time that I understand it. But then secondly, that many of these stakes they need to be defined. And the reason we have government is basically that until you have some kind of sovereign definitions of even what things are and what are being referred to, you can't have a productive debate, because you're not speaking the same thing. You're not using the same words to mean the same things. And so when you look at NAIR and when you look at the legislation that's now being proposed by many different people on the Hill, so the most important bits of those bills is the first 5-10 pages, where they're like, by AI we mean this, by data we mean this, by computation we mean this, and those definitions are either good or bad. But the point is, that's where a lot of the scaffolding is being built.
Have you read these definitions? Do you think they're okay? I think from the perspective of how all this is received, it seems like the government is well between the two goalposts that would be set by the fact community and the existential risk community, which in some ways would kind of resolve this safety ethics nonsense by the fact of there being a third entity, which is something that we for a long time talked about, okay, how do we create this third entity? And if just language models necessitated the government making it and being itself, would be pretty interesting.
That seems to be what is happening, yes.
And I from a recent history perspective, that seems like what's happening with the government doing something is actually pretty useful.
Sure. And it's different from the government stepping in and being like, well, here's just what actually matters. I think actually the government...
Do you think the tension of these two organizations made it so that the government's early action in AI was much more likely to be kind of middle ground? Because both of these communities have power that they could dispatch in DC to make it so the other one cannot completely win.
I agree with that, yes.
Especially with like a democratic executive branch. Because I think the like whole fairness community, whether or not they like it, some of their power is going to come from further on the left. Well, I do think that the safety people are going to be more politically neutral. They're going to at least give it off as that way. Whether or not they actually are is a discussion I don't really care about.
It's interesting. So to some extent, what seems to be going on and what has been going on is that the factions and polarities, if you want to call them ideological, that exist in AI seem so far to not entirely map onto the polarities and factions that exist in the partisan realm. But there are, to use a fancy sociological word, homologies or isomorphisms between certain elements of the ethics fact side of things and the political left, or and that's not just, it's not one-to-one, but certainly at the level of language, there are clear commonalities there. But it's complicated. And I think what stands out to me is the fact that so far, well, I said this already on a previous episode, I was quite impressed by the executive order, the White House executive order on AI that came out in late October. And the reason I was impressed with it was it did not take a side. It did not stipulate which of these factions should or should not be given more credence or authority or priority over the other. What it did was say, look, agencies need to figure out what their mandate is now that this new kid on the block, Gen AI, is coming. It's already here. There's no sign of it slowing down. So agencies need to start regularly reporting on what AI they're using, what AI they intend to use, who is it at each department or agency who's updating those choices, and more generally documenting what's already on the books and doing that in regular intervals so that we can at least keep a live wire and have receipts over what things are going to look like 6 to 12 months from now. And indeed, that's what's happened. So what we've seen subsequently is whether it's the recent LMB guidance on procurement, whether it's NAIR, whether it's, the updated hiring that NIST has been doing, which Nate mentioned, they're bringing on Paul and they're bringing on a few other Bay Area folks to get involved in that. This is all signs of progress, I think. And it's not so much a matter, like, I'm not interested in the scoreboard of like, who did they get from safety? Who did they get from something else? I think that's really not what it's about. I think what it's about is the government realizes that procedural decisions have to be made about how it is an agency can even continue to understand itself in this new context. And so they just need requisite expertise and forecasting, not in this kind of long-term sense, but just in 3 months, what have you done? And what do you see on the horizon for the next 3 months? That kind of level of record bookkeeping. And I respect that.
Yeah. I'm curious how this perspective compares to what New York's role would be. I don't really have a good sense for New York's role in AI and technology. I would guess that it might have some sort of overlap with the cultural, like the banking culture and the power it has there. I wouldn't be surprised because that still feels like it has a hold on New York, but I haven't mapped that into what the like AI actors are. I mean, we could get to the Bay Area last because I think it's more well known, but it's like, does New York have clear leverage over the AI discourse right now?
Again, I think it's useful to be aware of, even more generally, what is the Bay Area? what is New York? What is DC? Like, kind of suspend AI for a second. Historically, what is New York, or what has it been? It's been the capital of finance. It's been the capital of media. It's been the capital of a certain kind of meritocratic professionalism, which cuts across higher ed, because there's a lot of higher ed either in New York or near it. The sort of more general culture of like finance. So not just the fact that there's gobs of money, but that there's gobs of people who just move it around and keep tabs on it. And then, as I already mentioned, like a lot of journalists, a lot of like, I think a good example, let's be materialists here for a second, right? So Ezra Klein used to be based in DC, and he kind of climbed the ladder initially as like a policy wonk, like super blogger dude. You know, this was before Substacks, but I think he sort of had
Before Substackistan.
he had like an early version of that in like the mid to late aughts.
Yeah.
He then later relocated to the Bay Area, like to live, and I believe was even recording out of there, and he kind of set up shop. You can look at the history of like his episodes on his podcast and kind of get a sense of like where his conversations were going. And then he left the Bay Area and moved to New York. So he went to that city. And again, Ezra Klein's not in AI, but I think he's certainly somebody who has a read on and understands these different kinds of power. I think for him, he gave an episode recently where he said, or tried to account for it, there were, of course, personal reasons, which is healthy, I think. You know, you want to be close to family, or you want to build a life where you are. But he also said something to the effect of, he first and foremost thought of himself as a journalist. And there's a certain kind of culture and a vast kind of cultural, intellectual world of reporting and storytellers and journalists and writers and authors who live in the greater New York area and do see it as home, because that's where there is an established market for trying to make stories that can reach a mass audience. And I think that does set it apart, frankly, in some ways, from both the Bay Area and DC, which have very uniquely defined and intense forms of power, but in some ways quite insular. Like, you're kind of already one of the converted. If you're, living in the Bay Area, you're there, you've shown up, and yeah, sure, you listen to VCs, you listen to the tech bros, you listen to CEOs all day, but you're already the kind of person who's kind of bought in. And New York has this different kind of culture where it's a place for people to try out narratives and stories that cut across these, cultural divisions or worlds or factions. I'm not saying it always succeeds at that. New York has insularities too, but its culture is one where we can reach more eyes or ears or what have you, if you have the right narrative tools in your toolbox. Whereas I think people...
Do you think like this...
Yeah.
Like, do you think this is that tension? Like, does this provide tension to the Silicon Valley people? Like, Silicon Valley is probably the most insular of all of these, where it's trying to not... It, like, prides itself on being unregulated and kind of having weird dynamics where there's low risk for founders, so they're encouraged to build things, where it's like the founder that builds the startup, worst case they get acquired really cheap so they don't make nothing, but they're not a billionaire. There's all these weird, like, there's very little trade secret enforcement in the Bay Area. It's like kind of a collective winning type thing, a mentality when you zoom out, and how hyper-focused it is right now. So I'm leaving the Bay Area, and it's like, I almost expect it to be nicer when I can just come and tap into it, where it's like, okay, you come for a weekend and you meet with 8 people and you're like, this is nuts, but it's useful. Where it's probably a little bit too much to just be exposed to it all the time, at least in AI. I think it just is a little off kilter, where everyone that's like, oh, I'm in the, have you heard about this? In the arena, where it's like in the arena is this area from like the OpenAI office and like mission to like Noma or something. And it's like, what are y'all talking about? It's not real life.
I think the way I would describe it, it's a bit complicated. I feel like in the Bay Area and DC, you can build a life in either of those places that, if you want it to be normal, can feel normal. But if you really want to climb the ladder intensely, there are very few like foci of power, like sources of power, and they work in very specific ways. And I think actually what Silicon Valley and DC have in common is that at the end of the day, there's very few people who call the shots in both of those worlds, like at the tippy top. And it's either because they run one of these companies or they run one of the branches of government. It's like, and everyone sort of dances around those maypoles. In New York, as in all the rest of the world, the closest equivalent to that is just if you have the most money. If you're a billionaire, if you live on Billionaires Row, or the real power status thing is if you own a lot of land space on Billionaires Row, but you don't actually spend time there because you just sort of have it on reserve, I think is the real, like, the joke is that most of billionaires, this is for those who don't know. So Central Park.
Yeah, I was going to say, where's Billionaire Row?
So Central Park is kind of in the center of Manhattan, right? And what has been this important kind of interesting phenomenon over the past 15 years, maybe, like since the Great Recession, is that the street right on the southern edge, the south edge of Central Park, has become bought up by and sometimes just rebuilt as extremely, like, the most expensive apartments and penthouses in the world. And so it's kind of become informally known as Billionaires Row because, structurally speaking, you basically have to be or know.
There's a long Wikipedia article on Billionaires Row.
Is there? Okay. Yeah. So I've not read
it's not that long. It's not that long, but like for this random colloquial term to have like 6+ paragraphs in a list of buildings is pretty substantial.
So that's certainly a form of power that is distinctive to New York. And I think it's different though, because yes, having the most money will probably get you power of some kind anywhere. But in New York, there's certain industries, I already named them, finance and media are the most obvious, where those are the worlds that, like, that's just where the most money is. But even in that case, and it's kind of interesting that I'm making this argument right now because it kind of counteracts what I was about to say, but what makes both finance and media work is how interconnected they are with other people, right? Other parts of the economy. You're either somebody who has an enormous investment portfolio, and so you're somebody who has some kind of relationship with other parts of the economy, and that's by virtue of your being a billionaire. Or you are at the top of some media ecosystem where you presumably have a massive audience of people who either tune into your platform or that you have some kind of standing relationship with, right? So that could be a media conglomerate, or it could be, if you're one of the very few kind of writers in New York who has a large audience, like whatever. But the point is, like, I'm not sure if the way power works in DC or the Bay Area obeys the same kind of relational logic, right? Like, how many people does Sam Altman have to interact with in a given month? Like a month. I probably not very many people, because he's sitting on top of such a very particular hotspot in not just the economy, but just the future of what infrastructure can be, that there's not kind of much else he has to do other than just continue to occupy that position. And that's in some ways not a dynamic place to be as a result. And likewise in DC, like, I'm painting in broad strokes here, but like if you're a Supreme Court justice, I don't think you need to talk to very many people at all. You're kind of just in this position where the world looks to you, it listens to you, and you just have been conferred with authority to pull certain levers or make certain kinds of judgments or decisions that then have these, they radiate outwards what these effects are. And so there's a certain kind of accountability, I think, that New York has, at least at the level of responsiveness to the rest of the world, that I'm not sure DC or Silicon Valley, Bay Area have, because they don't have to.
My sense is that DC has not been as involved so early in a technology's development as it has for AI, and that's probably the thing that is unsettling to people. I think historically, with the like growth of Google, Meta, Amazon, whatever, Apple, like with all these companies, there was so little tech regulation for so long, which was kind of characteristic of their rise. And this is like the defining thing is now DC is actually trying to be involved early on. But I think a lot of people in the Bay just think that's like, I mean, the people that worry about the safety of these things encourage some sort of actual regulation, not that we know what it would mean. I don't know if regulation is the right word, but I tend to feel like that's the cultural tension point, where I think like New York and the Bay Area have kind of always had this tie at the hip. It was given like New York is the gate by which all these startups IPO if they want an IPO. It's like that is literally true.
Mm-hmm.
But the DC stuff still feels new.
It's interesting. There's also a parallel here to like, you think of a company, you think of Amazon. So there's this line, there's a few lines from this article that, you know, our listeners should look at if they haven't already. It's an important article called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox, which Lena Khan wrote, maybe when she was still in law school or shortly after graduating.
It was when she was in law school.
Yeah. So there's a part in this article where she says something like, she's trying to account for Amazon as a phenomenon in the economy. And she's talking about this dynamic that we're all familiar with, where famously for the first many years of its existence, Amazon did not make money. They were basically growing a platform that was well positioned to be this critical component in supply chains until it eventually could just agglomerate those supply chains. And then later, much later in its life, starts just making, I mean, she sort of says, as much money as they want, because it becomes something like an essential component in the distribution of goods. And there's a line in it where she says something like, it's as if Jeff Bezos looked up antitrust law as it stood in the early 90s and then designed a company that could exist in such a way and grow such that antitrust law was just blind to it.
I mean, that's kind of how I feel like most tech is seen right now.
Well, that's why I'm bringing it up. Exactly.
I didn't know that was actually in the Lena Khan.
Well, I think to her credit, I think she says it's as if. So she's not directly impugning intent, but I think
I don't think I don't think they could do anything about impugning the desiderata of being antitrustable.
I think it matters though, because what is she saying there? What she's saying is Amazon was a country that you can think of actually as being conceived in the context of this legal and political ecosystem that in a way started in DC, right? This period of like antitrust after Robert Bork became very narrowly defined around.
After what?
Robert Bork, who was a legal scholar who came up. He was at the University of Chicago when the University of Chicago was producing, you know, what are now like the founding fathers of neoliberal economics, right? It's like this new genre of whether it's Milton Friedman, whether it's Bork, whether it's Ronald Coase, you know, theory of the firm, all of these people who most of them went on to win Nobel Prizes, you know, in the 90s and 2000s. But the people who created the intellectual edifice for states really just exist to help create markets, because markets are better in pretty much every measurable sense of the term for governance than government itself. So I don't know if we have time to explore all the details of what that means here, but one implication of it is that an argument that came out of them was to say the government should not be in the business of breaking up business. It really shouldn't be in the business of trying to tell business how big to get or what to do. All it should do is make sure companies can verify that getting bigger is in the consumer's interest, ultimately.
Yeah.
Either
the thing that's always confused me about neoliberalism is I've never understood the word and why like neo attached to liberalism means this thing.
Oh, I can take a stab at that. This is a bit of a live wire, but I have a good degree.
Oh, it is? That's great. I love asking stupid questions.
No, it's not a stupid question. I think it's actually a really important question. And it does bear on the flavor of this conversation. Because what this conversation we've been having is about the AI world is changing in such a way that DC is becoming important within it. But we don't know to what extent. We don't know what that means. And so it's important because under neoliberalism, it took inspiration in some ways from classical liberalism. In classical liberalism, the idea is it's Adam Smith, basically. Okay, so markets are important because providing more freedom to individual firms, businesses, and also consumers is orders of magnitude more wealth generating than direct state control of industry. Okay, so he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. And that's
I've heard of it.
It's not mysterious. Like that's his point, is that like the reason we should have free markets it's not some ideological thing. It's really just it will be better off for nations if they'd all agree to support free markets because of everything we now it's ingrained in us, economies of scale, the invisible hand, right? All that jazz. That's classical liberalism. What neoliberalism does is it changes the calculus a bit, where rather than the government stepping back and letting markets step in, it's more subtle. It's like the government itself should itself be the thing that creates markets, right? And the reason it does that is if the state has some goal that it can't otherwise achieve, it's better off achieving it through market incentives than directly policing or trying to control the thing itself. So it's almost like neoliberalism is not even about wealth generation. It's actually about control and regulation, but by means of the market rather than by means of the state directly. And that's an undercurrent here. So again, it's this idea that, to return to Borg,
yeah, it's active versus passive.
Yeah,
but with the same active versus passive use of the same mechanism.
I think that's fair. Yeah. So what Bork's point was to say firms actually by default should be allowed and maybe even encouraged to be made bigger, because things like economies of scale and lots of other stuff tend to advantage the consumer because they tend to make end goods cheaper or easier to produce, or there's any number of other possible benefits to the consumer that are quantifiable, that larger firms tend to be able to produce, that smaller firms struggle to do. And it's a kind of a beautiful argument. And Kahn's point was that it basically just radically shrunk people's imaginations of what harm could be, frankly, because it's not, at the end of the day, just about consumer utility. It's also about the middle person, right? So Amazon itself, there's a whole bunch of stuff Amazon doesn't make, right? Suppliers make it for now, sure. But originally what Amazon did was it was sort of just a place where suppliers could sell their goods.
Yeah.
So it benefited consumers, but it was kind of not always obvious the extent to which it benefited suppliers. You could make a similar argument with Airbnb, for example, right? The fact that Airbnb might be super convenient for me to use, because it massively expands my options for where I might stay. But it's hard to be somebody who owns an Airbnb in lots of ways, because you're kind of subject entirely to whatever policies Airbnb dictates for, cleaning and a number of other things, right? So anyway, I think this all matters because this is a shift. So Lena Khan is now head of the FTC. DC is changing. It's changing in its willingness to pursue mergers. It's changing in how it thinks about tech. And
it's like mergers is the only lever that they have to actually stop the companies with current antitrust laws. Because I think there's like a ceiling by which tech companies becoming too big does cause some sort of consumer harm, because these companies are so efficient and require so much capital and investment and become so powerful just by nature of making so much money. That's like the loop that we're closing back in on. Or like that was the loop that was closing before AI really happened. And then AI is making this conversation take a slightly different flavor.
There's a diversity of harms that big tech does end up bringing back to the table, or just new types of harms that it introduces from scratch, right? So, and these are being increasingly cataloged, right? The fact that we've so far been treating tech pretty much like this, again, alchemy that just gets created in the ether of the internet and then can just be used by anybody. And that's purpose-built to the kind of antitrust environment that Robert Bork believed in. And that, it's like, if there's no material cost to creating, an API or software, then it's really just a question of like, what's the company that can get big enough to add the most value to the consumer? And indeed, that's been what we've seen for the past 25 years in terms of where tech has kind of gone. And it is shifting now. You're going to see all sorts of weird, interesting claims being made about the environmental impacts of what it takes to train, and develop AI systems, where these data silos are. There are whole parts of Nebraska that apparently have just basically become server farms because they have to be somewhere. Like you have to keep these things somewhere physical.
They have to distribute around the country, otherwise they mess up the power grid.
Right. And I think energy is going to be a major axis of this as well, right? The fact that it takes a huge amount of electricity to really sustain this. We've been talking about this more recently on Pod, that there are they're going to end up being powerful material constraints on either how big the models can get at what cost, or who bears the cost of continuing to scale at the rate that we've been scaling. And that's the kind of problem space that you have to have policymakers, and for lack of a better word, just politics has to be the thing that adjudicates that conversation, because it's just not something that you can trust to a private company. Not because they don't trust the companies, but just because it's like an analytic distinction. The companies are not there to define how those kinds of trade-offs or value priorities can be made. There's just no way for them to do that. It's an inherently political question. They can have views on it. They do have views. We've been hearing them stay with these views on. And so, I think this is where it's going. Whether it's the fact that, ethics and safety their memes run out of steam. And at a certain point, the question becomes, who is the person who defines a standard for, how this model could function or not, and what circumstances? And that, at the end of the day, is why NIST is hiring who they're hiring, who defines what a good experiment is to evaluate, these risk profiles, for example. And then secondly is something like what we've just been talking about. What are the antitrust considerations of the next wave of this stuff? Someone has to be the force of deliberating about that. And it's either the public directly, or it's the people who stand for the public, which again would be the FTC or DOJ or some other department, probably within the executive branch.
Yeah, I would hope that more laws could actually be passed, but I think that's a separate conversation.
I mean, Congress ultimately will be the thing. Especially, we don't yet know the extent of this horizon. I think is the point.
I think AI could be the impetus by past laws that actually do touch on antitrust. AI is like a very non-apolitical thing on the Hill in some ways. Like AI has a lot of support for a lot of like making sure that it goes right, which is at the end of the long winding path of tech support or not support. But it's just like refreshing it has made all of that kind of get a new angle by which these things could move forward.
And the other dimension of it, you already implicitly highlighted it, is the antitrust dimension also comes in because this is about how do we keep America competitive, right, on this technology. It's not just, are we upset at how big one of these companies is? It's how do we make sure that the ecosystem of these companies as it exists is one that can give America a leg up, either on talent or on where the latest and greatest tech ends up being built and why, and how do we create incentives to make that true. So that's not exactly a neoliberal problem. It's a different kind of problem. It's still about incentives, but really about how do we make it so that this kind of geopolitical market between the US, China, and maybe the EU, however else we think the major competitors will shake out there. How do we make the US itself be competitive? Not just have its companies respect public mandates.
Yeah, we're going to have you be the retort representative on all these political things. You need to go watch if they sign a bill. You'd be like, I was there.
Yeah. It is funny. Actually, it's interesting how I saw this on LinkedIn not too long ago. I don't know if I can dig it up, but somebody, I won't say the person's name, but somebody referred to the retort as the best of the techno-libertarian podcasts. Which I didn't respond to. It amuses me for lots of reasons, but I don't think of myself as falling into whatever that name, I guess, implies. I think of what we're doing, and I've said this, as a kind of like lucid dreaming atop the space of how bizarre AI is, where, I try and add clarity when I can. I'm also honest about what my values are. I think sooner or later the chips are going to fall in a way that structural decisions have to get made. And I think generally libertarians don't speak that way.
Yeah, I don't think we're techno-libertarian. I'm reading this.
You found it?
I found the Wikipedia page. It's short. There are not many techno-libertarians out there, I'm guessing. It has roots in the early hacker cyberpunk culture of Silicon Valley in the 1990s. The philosophy focuses on minimizing government regulation, censorship, or anything else in the way of the free World Wide Web. I feel like this is the EAX, the acceleration land. In this case, the word free is referring to the meaning of libre, no restrictions, and not gratis, no cost. Cyber libertarians embrace fluid, meritocratic hierarchies which are believed to best served by markets.
So again, that's the neoliberal side.
The most widely known cyber libertarian is Julian Assange, the publisher of WikiLeaks. What?
Okay, sorry, I found the quote on LinkedIn. Here's a listener who says, I've listened to a few episodes. It is the most technically useful and listenable among the, quote, kinder, gentler, unquote, cyber libertarian insider engineering centered shows about LLMs.
Wow. Put that on our website. That is a mouthful.
Honestly, that was my first thought, was like, this is a kind of a badge of honor.
We've carved such a specific niche that no one can beat us.
Kinder, gentler, cyber libertarian insider engineering centered show about LLMs.
I love how all of this cultural things are about LLMs. Like, I get a lot of praise for my quote unquote coverage of LLMs. I'm like, I kind of hate this. People are like, why has AI been reduced to LLMs?
People are scared. I think people are.
Because also, like,
yeah,
like language models are also used in AI systems that are well more complicated than language models. There's like multiple models used in these systems, and it's just not what people think.
My sense is that people feel like we're locked into a future that's coming that we can't do anything about. And so anybody who can provide even like a wisp of a hope of agency where I at least feel better informed is like seems to be of value. And so I think that's what it is. But I think the shape of this conversation has been, we're all these different like legs of this tripod, they're all kind of weighing it different ways and kind of responding to each other's energies or what they think each other's energies are. And a lot of what good governance means, regardless of ideology, is if those kinds of conflicts or those kinds of worlds are inevitably going to be different and in tension with each other, how can we make it so that they can be coordinated in a constructive way rather than a dysfunctional or toxic way? Because it's certainly pretty dysfunctional and toxic right now. I don't think that's inevitable. I think that leadership right now is going to mean who can cut across the misperceptions and set tables that otherwise might not be able to be set, where representatives from these different worlds are able to feel like they can contribute in good faith. And that's way easier said than done. But I think that's the challenge.
I agree. I do think there are bright lights leading us there. There are not many, but enough that we can stand on for now.
Seems like a good place to stop.
Yeah. I'll be in the neck of your neck of the woods for like 24 hours.
Text me, I guess. We'll see. I'm in Arlington, so a few stops away.
Sounds good.
Okay. See you, everybody.
Later.
Bye.
Bye.